we're just going to take an overview of all of those hurdles that you're going to have to jump over in order, hopefully, to successfully secure a place at medical school or at dental school. Because there are a whole lot of things that you're going to have to think about and prepare for. And I just think it's useful to sort of know what lies ahead of you. And then in subsequent weeks, we'll start looking at some of those in a lot more detail. So these are the things that we're going to just talk about briefly today. We're going to have a look at the GCSE requirements of the different medical and dental schools, because it is really important that you make sure that what you've got fits the bill, because unfortunately they tend to be totally inflexible on these things. So there's no point applying to places which are going to rule you out just because you don't have the right GCSEs, because the application would just go straight in the bin, unfortunately. But the good news is that they do vary a lot, and so hopefully we can find at least some places that you'll be able to apply to, even if your GCSEs are a little bit patchy. Then we're going to talk about the experience that you need to have of working with people, and the experience that you hopefully will be able to get also of sort of watching doctors or dentists doing what they do. We'll talk about why those things are useful and what you're going to need to get out of them that will support your application. We'll talk about the aptitude test, which all of you will have to do because all universities use this, and we'll look at how they use it, why it's important in the application process. We'll think about the strategy that you're going to need to use to make sure that you apply to appropriate places. And then we'll talk about the actual mechanics of the application process. So UCAS is the system that universities use for organising university applications, and all of the medical and dental schools use that, and it has various things that you have to complete, but the one that requires the most effort is the personal statements. We'll talk briefly about that. And finally, the final step, the one which actually allows them to make the decision of who gets offers to go there and who doesn't, is the interview, and we'll talk about what that involves. Okay, so that's the plan for today. All right, so let's start with GCSE. So there's a complication here, which is that there are two sort of different ways that universities can use GCSEs. The first one, which is the most straightforward one, is that everywhere has a sort of minimum requirement. So you need to have at least these grades, otherwise we won't consider your application. And those are easy to find. They're published in all the prospectuses, and that's not a problem so long as you actually have those grades. The more complicated thing, though, is that some of the universities, having checked that you've met the minimum grades, ticked that box, they then still look further at your GCSEs and they calculate a score based on a number of the GCSEs that you've done, and they use that score together with a score from your UCAT test and sometimes from contextual factors as well, and they use that score to decide who gets interviews. So at those universities, it's not enough to have met the minimum requirements that we talked about a minute ago, because if you've just about met them, the chances are that your score is not going to be competitive against all the other people who might, some of whom might have really very high grades. So it's important that you know which are the places that do this scoring system and, as far as possible, how they do it. So that's something that we know a lot about, and so we can help you with that. Again, it is published to some extent, although in some places it's clearer than others how exactly they do it. Dental schools are much less transparent about what their application sifting process actually is. Unfortunately, they feel the need to keep it all a bit secret. So we don't tend to know exactly how they use GCSEs, beyond having the minimum requirements. But my feeling is that it's less of an issue there, that they rely more on the personal statement and and especially the UCAT, rather than on scoring GCSEs. Okay, so let's look at some examples here then. So this is a slightly complicated table, but you can see that what you've got is a bunch of universities listed down here, and then across here that there what they look for in terms of GCSEs. So let's look at Anglia Ruskin, say, which is going to be this row across here. And you can see that in this first column, this is GCSE science. So this means if you did separate sciences, this is going to mean chemistry and biology in general. They tend to be less interested in physics, although there are one or two exceptions to that. But chemistry and biology primarily is what that means. So Anglia Ruskin will require you to have at least a 6 in chemistry and in biology. Otherwise, they just won't look at your application. This is maths. Again, you need to have at least a 6. English means English language in general. So you need to have at least a 6 for that. And then you can see, even beyond this, they want you to have at least 5 6s. Otherwise, they say that's not an application we're going to look at. So your other GCSEs may count to some extent as well. But once you've met those minimum requirements, what this last column tells you is that they don't then think about your GCSEs anymore. So they don't calculate some kind of score based on them. If you're from Wales, you might be wondering what all these numbers are. So again, because there's not an exact correspondence between the numbers and the letter grades that you get in Wales, it can be slightly difficult to work out exactly what they want. Most of them will tell you what the equivalent grades are that they're looking for, but mostly it's going to be that 9 would correspond to an A star, 7 or 8 would correspond to an A, 6 would correspond to a B. So for Anglia Ruskin, you'd basically be looking for Bs in science, maths and English to meet the requirements. So you can see, just looking down the list, that looking for a bunch of 6s is very common. A few of them go a little bit higher. You can see down here, East Anglia and Edinburgh looking for lots of 7s, which would be, A's in Wales. And East Anglia particularly is looking for 6 7s, 6 A's. So you need to have really quite a strong GCSE profile to be considered by them. There are also some other ones which look a bit lower, but you need to be a little bit careful with those. So Belfast, you think, oh, they're only looking for 4s, so that's good. It's going to be much easier to meet their minimum requirement. But you can see over here, the sting in the tail is that they, having checked you meet the minimum, they calculate a score for you. And actually, if you only had 4s and 5s, there's no way your score would be competitive against other people's scores in deciding who gets interviews. So actually, you need pretty good GCSEs, mostly 7s, 8s, 9s, to have a chance at Belfast. And Cambridge is the sort of extreme example of that, where you can see they have no entries there at all, and in their prospectus it does say, oh, we have no specific requirements for GCSEs. But what it actually says is, we have no specific requirements, but it's useful for you to know that more than 90% of our applicants have all grades 8 and 9. In other words, all A stars. So in effect, it's saying your GCSEs ought to be pretty good if for you to have a chance here. So it's a quite mixed picture. Here are a bunch more of them, and there are a couple of examples here of ones which genuinely do have lower hurdles, and Plymouth stands out there, where you can see that they do only require 4s in these subjects, 7 4s altogether across your GCSEs, and that's enough to meet the minimum requirement, and they don't have a GCSE score. So if your GCSEs are a bit patchy, Plymouth is always going to be one to look at where it's a little bit easier. And Leeds as well, you can see that they're 5s, although they do have a scoring system. They don't tell you what it is, so it's hard to know whether that's going to be something that's going to be good enough if you've got sort of lots of slightly lower ones like that. So we will help you. If you've got great GCSEs, it's not a problem. You're going to be able to apply pretty much anywhere from that point of view. But if yours are a bit mixed and you're not sure, then obviously we can help you because we've had lots of experience with these things, and so we can help to minimize the chances that you apply to places where you're just going to fall at the first hurdle. Here's an example of a scoring system. So Leicester has a system where they will give you a score based on your UCAT test, and then they will add to that a score based on your GCSEs, and then the people they will interview will be the ones who have the best scores overall from that sum. And the GCSE score is worked out like this. So you can see on the right hand side over here that you get maximum points for an A star, a 9, and then lower points as you go down. And they do that for 8 GCSEs, and that's why even the ones in subjects you thought would never matter, unfortunately do matter at this point, because you've got your English language, maths and double science as normal, or chemistry and biology, but then they look at 4 other subjects, whatever your best 4 other ones are, to calculate your score. And all the places that score have their own system. Some of them look at only 5 GCSEs, some of them look at 9 GCSEs. So again, depending on what you've actually got, you need to play the game of looking at where you get the best score to make you most competitive. For dentistry, here's the situation. You can see that it's sort of similar. They all have minimum requirements, but they tend to be a little bit more challenging actually, because you can see lots of these have 7s, that they require in lots of subjects. So 6 7s at Sheffield, 7 7s at Manchester, and Birmingham actually requires a bunch of it requires 8s in science as well as 7s in maths and English. So it's a little bit tougher actually for dentistry than it is for medicine, but again there's a lot of variability, so we can help you play the game of making sure that you don't fall foul of those when you put an application in. Okay, so I won't say any more about GCSEs now. If you are concerned about your GCSE profile, please do let me know, and then I can have a look at what you've got and check that there are going to be some places, and if there are issues we can have a chat about it. So get in touch if you are concerned about your GCSE profile. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the work experience, volunteering, and other activities, including part-time jobs, sporting activities, things that can be useful to you in giving a good impression of yourself as a candidate for these kind of courses. And that's going to come up first of all when you have to write a personal statement. So this is part of your UCAS application, which has to go in at the beginning of October, so almost as soon as you come back, the beginning of the second year. And in that personal statement, effectively you're writing a sort of self-advertisement to say to them, yeah, I've got the qualities you need to be a successful student. And one of the ways that you can convince them of that is by showing them what you've been doing already, working with people and so on, and that's where this is going to come in. But where it really, really comes in is when you get to interviews, because unless you apply to Oxford or Cambridge, where they will take an interest in your scientific ability, nowhere else do they really ask you any science questions, because they take the view that you don't have to be an absolute genius to succeed as a dentist or as a doctor. You obviously have to be smart, you have to do problem solving, and you have to learn a huge amount of information, but you don't have to be that kind of person who just understands it at a fantastically deep level. And for that reason, they don't need to test that ability at interview. They just say, well, if you can get 3 A's at A level and you've got some reasonable GCSEs, then we're confident that your intellectual ability is going to be fine for the course that you've got to take on. And so what they focus on is the other question that's very relevant to doctors and dentists, which is, are you going to be good at working with people? And that means both working with your patients, but also working with your colleagues, and related things like, are you going to be good at coping with the stress of these jobs? And your interviews will probe those things. So they'll ask you a bunch of sometimes quite strange questions, but often they'll sort of ask you things like, why is it important for a clinician to show empathy with his patients, meaning to be able to understand what that patient is feeling and experiencing as they're going through the problems they have and as they're going through the treatment that you're giving them. And everybody will learn to answer that question theoretically, about what the importance of empathy is. But you can give a much stronger answer if you can back it up by saying, well, I discovered how important empathy was in this volunteering I was doing, or in this work I was doing, coaching kids to play football or whatever. If you can sort of show that you really, really understand empathy because you yourself have needed it in those kind of situations, it makes your job much easier in convincing them that you're a good candidate. And that's the real importance of these other activities. So let's just have a look at what a university says about this. Obviously, as with the GCSEs, they're all different in what they say about it, and most places don't say that much, to be honest. But Manchester has quite an interesting little commentary on it. So this is Manchester Medicine. And you can see that they ask you to talk about experience in a caring role. So that's why we've been encouraging you to do some volunteering. Because some universities like this specifically say that they're interested in your experience in a caring role. And if you don't have one, then obviously that's a problem. But most universities are more flexible than that. So here they're talking about things like care homes, working with Venture, working at the hospice, working in the hospital, working with people with learning support needs and that kind of thing. So that's really what they mean by caring. But a lot of the universities are more flexible than that, and they will take on board things you write about based, for example, on a part-time job, so long as it involves working directly with people. So, for example, if you work in a restaurant or something, then you probably learn a lot about working with difficult people, trying to understand how to talk to people in a way that will, maximize what a positive impression they form of the restaurant, and will minimize the problems when they're not happy. So that can almost be better than volunteering sometimes for some aspects like that, and they will take that on board as well. A lot of them will ask about what responsibilities have you taken on, and often it's easier to achieve levels of responsibility in a job than it is in a volunteering setting. So all of these things are relevant, but somehow you're going to need to be able to convince them about your people skills. But notice what they do also say in this section, which is that they don't want you to talk about examples of shadowing in this section. And in general, across the board in medicine, they're really not very interested in hearing about what you've seen when you've watched doctors or other clinicians doing what they do. That doesn't mean that's not worth doing, but it's not what's going to make the difference when it comes to personal statements or when it comes to interviews. That's not quite the same in dentistry. Some of the dental schools do still require you to do that. So if you're a dentist, you're going to have to try to get placements in dental practices where you can spend a week or so watching them do what they do. And it is becoming more difficult as dental practices are becoming more and more, private institutions. They don't sort of feel the need to sort of play their part in supporting public functions, NHS supporting functions like providing placements for students. And unfortunately, a lot of them will just say no. But if you try enough different places and are persistent, if they just ignore you to start with, it is still possible to get those placements. And some of the dental schools do still require them. Birmingham does, Newcastle does, for example. But other ones don't. Other ones say it's optional because they've woken up to the fact that it's getting a bit unfair because there aren't that many dental practices that will provide that kind of experience. For medicine, if again, it can be worthwhile you doing it because never mind that they may not ask you about it at interview, but first of all, in your own mind, you need to be clear that this is what you want to be doing. Okay, because in effect, you're not just signing up for a university course here, you're probably signing up for what you're going to spend the rest of your life doing. And you want to make sure that's the right decision. So people who've done shadowing often will come back and say, yeah, it was really inspirational. It's really motivated me to make sure I get the A levels I need and so on. But sometimes we do get people who come back who say, oh, it just seemed really dull. That's not what I want to do. I've realized that now. And so it was really worthwhile them doing that before they went down the wrong road. So it's useful for that reason. And it's useful also because, coming back to the empathy question that we had before, part of it is you've got to talk about why empathy was important in the roles that you've had. But obviously, if you can relate that to why empathy is important in a clinical setting, then again, that makes for a stronger answer. And you can find out, from internet resources and from talking to people why it's important. But obviously, if you've seen examples of doctors who are particularly empathic and maybe ones who aren't, and why that had, a negative effect on patients, then that will help you understand and talk about those things. And obviously the same with dentistry. So what I'm saying is shadowing, if you're interested in doing it, I think it's a really good thing to do, and it's worth trying if you're a doctor, a medical applicant, it's not the end of the world if you can't find it. You can gain all the information you need from internet resources. You can, for example, do online work experience for free for medicine. For dentistry, though, it is really helpful if you can secure it, but it's not the end of the world. There are enough good dental schools you can apply to which don't actually require it if that becomes necessary, but really try as much as you can for dentistry. But the volunteering or a part-time job that you can talk about in a similar way relate to your ability to interact effectively with people. That is important for everyone, and so you need to organise something along those lines. If you're not sure about whether the stuff you're doing is going to tick those boxes, again, just let me know. Tell me what you're doing, and I'll get back to you. And if hopefully I'll say, yeah, that sounds absolutely great. We have had increasingly in the last couple of years people who've mainly talked about jobs or talked about things that don't obviously count as caring, and who've comfortably got offers. So it is a lot more flexible than it used to be, but just get in touch with me if you're not sure. This is interesting as well, that Manchester points out that they want to hear about the other stuff you do in your spare time. And a lot of the universities do that, and a lot of them will ask you about that at interviews. So quite an important message there is, don't give up the stuff you do for relaxation and for wider enjoyment, because actually they're interested in that. They like the idea that someone who's going to be a successful doctor or dentist has to have the energy to be doing really well in their A-levels and to be doing the volunteering work experience stuff and still have time to do something really significant in their spare time. So this is where your sports come in. If you play sports, this is where your music comes in. This is whatever other activities you do come in. And Keele University, for example, for medicine, which is a place that has quite an important role for us, because it's the place we can often get people to apply to successfully, even if their UCAT hasn't gone very well, which we'll talk about in a minute, because they primarily select on your personal statement, and they ask you to talk about something that you do in your spare time, and they say that you need to show that this is something you've shown real commitment to over a period of time. So it's worth thinking about that, and thinking about what you can say about it that makes it sound interesting and rewarding, but most of all that shows that you've put a lot of energy and time into not necessarily being hugely successful at it. They're not really judging you on whether you're a brilliant rugby player or not, but how devoted to getting the most out of your rugby you've been. That can be really important. Okay, so again, we'll come back to that when we talk about personal statements. They're interested in team working, so again, any activities you do in a team can be useful for that, and they're interested in why you want to be a doctor or a dentist, and we'll give you lots of thoughts about what to talk about for that. Okay, so let's talk about the next thing which you all are going to have to face, and that is the aptitude test. So UCAT is something quite unlike exams that you've probably done in the past. It's not a traditional written exam, and it doesn't test your knowledge or understanding of science in any way. So this is what it is. It's a totally online thing, so no written component, and you don't do it in college. You will have to book a test at a test centre, and there's one in Hereford, which is the place that you might know where people do the driving theory test. But there are ones in lots of towns around if you're not local to Hereford. And it's a sort of 2-hour, really intense online test. All multiple choice, and there are various different types of questions, as it says there. There are 4 sections that you're going to have to go through. None of them to do with science, no writing. So over the next few weeks, we'll talk about the kinds of questions that you get. If you've ever done an IQ test, it's a little bit like those where you just have to puzzle things out, and they claim to be able to calculate how smart you are, based on how well you do in these random puzzles. It's a little bit like that, except that they're not so random, so you really know what the format of the questions is going to be in advance if you've done the preparation that we're going to prompt you to do. But what it really is about is being incredibly quick. So the first section, verbal reasoning, which it lists there, that means it's a bit like stuff you'll have done in GCSE English, where they give you a passage of text and then they ask you a bunch of questions to check how well you've understood it. And when you look at the questions initially, you think, oh, well, they're not that hard. I can do that, no problem. And then you discover just how quickly you have to do them. That's something that you might think, oh, it only took me a minute to do that, but you'd only actually have 20 seconds. And that's the hard thing. So you are, for example, probably going to have to increase your reading speed to do really well at this. And that's why lots of preparation for UCAT is going to be important. So here's an example or a couple of examples of how they use it. Sorry, these are slightly old examples, so things may have changed slightly at these particular places, but the principles are still the same. So this was back in 2022. Newcastle Medical School got 6 applicants for every place they were prepared to offer, and they can't interview that many people. Their staff have lives to get on with. They can't get through that many people, so they need to find a way of throwing the majority of applications out before they even get to the interview stage. And UCAT was what they then used as the main way of doing that selection. So they would check the minimum GCSE requirements, and then everyone else, they would just list them in order of UCAT score, and just take the top however many they had interview places for. And it's brutal, but that's what they do. Actually, Newcastle has changed. They now take your GCSEs into account as well. But quite a lot of universities do still just do exactly that. Bristol, for example, does exactly that. So that means that it's not enough just to be okay. You need to be careful if you talk to older people, who got into medicine maybe 20 years ago, because they'll say, oh, UCAT was nothing to worry about, it's just a low hurdle. So long as you don't absolutely bomb in it, you'll be fine. And that was true then, but it's absolutely not true now. It's become the dominant thing in the selection process. Birmingham, slightly different example. You can see they have a slightly more sophisticated approach. So they do take UCAT into account, but the score they give you for UCAT is only 40% of what decides whether you get an interview. They also score you on your GCSE grades, and they take contextual factors into account. We'll talk about contextual factors later when we're looking at where to choose to apply to. Because again, all universities do it differently. Some of them don't do it at all, at this stage at least. But some of them take account of things like, the school where you did your GCSEs. If that's a school that doesn't get particularly high results in general, then they might give you some sort of extra points to compensate for that. Sometimes they just look at the postcode you live at, and if people who live there tend to, for example, not progress to higher education as frequently as in other places, then again they'll give you some extra points to compensate for that. So those things can be quite important. At Birmingham, for example, the school you went to is really important. If you went to a grammar school or an independent school, you don't get any contextual points, and that makes it quite challenging. You have to be really good on the other things to be competitive. But not everywhere is like that. So again, it all feeds into making the right decisions about where to apply to. So lots of people do UCAT. And so you get a nice statistical bell curve when you look at all the results that are achieved in a year like this. And so it's quite interesting to know, well, where do you have to be on that curve to be a successful applicant? And it varies a lot at different places. So obviously your average UCAT person is going to be in the middle there. So, sorry, this pointer's not working. In the middle there. So that's an average score for UCAT. And as I say, 20 years ago, you didn't even have to be average necessarily. As long as you were sort of fairly close to the average, you'd be okay. But unfortunately, that is no longer true. So let's look at Liverpool, for example. And this was the picture at Liverpool. You had to be in the top 28% or so of applicants. So, more or less the top quarter of applicants. So you had to be better than an awful lot of people. And the only way you get to be that good for most people is just by doing huge amounts of practice. Because as I say, it's about speed. And the only way you get quick at doing anything is by repetitive practice. And that's what really works for UCAT. So, yeah, you had to be pretty good for Liverpool, but they're actually one of the more generous ones in general. So here's Manchester. You had to be in the top 20%. And Newcastle, in that year, you had to be in the top 12%. And that's actually not the worst. The worst ones tend to be Bristol, University College and Imperial College in London, and Oxbridge. And at Bristol last year, for example, you had to be in the top 9% of students. So you had to be really, really good at UCAS to achieve these things. But the point is, it is possible to get really good at it, even if to start with you find it very challenging. And that's what we'll really focus on when we look at UCAS in detail. But it's a big factor. We've had quite a few people in recent years who've just had a bad day on their UCAS test, even though they'd prepared for it. It does happen. And mostly we did manage to find places they could apply to, and they had successful applications. So it's not a catastrophe if it doesn't go as well as you'd hoped, but it does severely restrict your choices. And because we know about what expectations are likely to be, we can't know exactly, unfortunately. So it does tend to fluctuate from year to year. So, for example, 2 years ago, Manchester had a small number of applicants for whatever reason, just statistical fluctuations, and so they had to make their cut-off lower than it was normally. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had enough candidates to interview. But then, of course, everybody saw what their cut-off score was that year, because some universities publish them, and you can also kind of get a lot of information from social media about them. And so everybody thought, oh, Manchester had a really low cut-off, let's all apply there, which meant that this year loads of people applied to Manchester, and so the cut-off's gone right up again. So it is a bit of game playing, and you can't know for sure, but imperfect information is still a lot better than no information, and that's what we can help you with. Okay, so choosing where to apply. You need to sort of know what the framework is that we're talking about here. So UCAS is this university application system, and the UCAS form that is an online form you'll fill in starting at the end of this year, but finishing it off in September. And you can choose 5 courses only to apply to in any given year. And for medicine and dentistry, they have a particular stipulation that although you can apply for 5 overall, only 4 of those can be medicine, or only 4 can be dentistry. You could apply, and some people actually do, for 4 dentistry courses and 1 medicine course, or vice versa, and that is possible, although it's a little bit challenging when it comes to the personal statement. But generally, the 5th one is an interesting question. What will you do with it? And a lot of people just leave it blank because they say, well, the only thing I'm interested in is dentistry, so I'm not going to bother putting a 5th one down because, if I don't get in this year, I'll just reapply next year. And that's fine. That's a legitimate thing to do. But you have to think about, what that 5th choice is there for. And it's there so that you have a backup plan. That's their thinking in putting it there, because it's so that because they recognize that these things are very competitive. Remember, 3.5 to 4 applicants per place. A lot of people are not going to get in, and they wanted to have those people to be able to have a backup plan. That's why the 5th choice is there. And as I say, you might think, well, my backup plan is to reapply next year, but you might want to think, well, what if I mess my A-levels up a bit? Because that would then mean you'd not just have to reapply, but you'd have to resit A-levels. And not all of the medical and dental schools actually accept resits, unfortunately. So again, you'd have a narrowed selection of places you could apply to. So it may be worth having a backup plan, because if you end up with A-levels that are significantly less than you need, then it's probably just not going to be possible to do medicine or dentistry at this stage. But you can still do it as a graduate. So you could go to university, do 3 years of whatever subject you're interested in, probably in some kind of biological science, because some of the universities like that, but actually most of them don't care what you do your degree in. If you've done a degree, you can then apply to study as a graduate, either on a specific graduate course or sometimes on one of the same courses you'd be applying for now. But applying as a graduate, they then will be more relaxed about your A-levels and indeed your GCSEs. So it is an important route. Something like a quarter of medical graduates are actually people who've gone into medicine as postgraduate students, having already done a degree in something else. So it's an important route. And so that 5th choice can be your passport onto that route if your A-levels get messed up. So it is worth thinking about. But if you want to leave it blank for this year, then do that. But just be aware that it might result in you having a sort of extra gap year that you might not have been planning on. So how difficult is this process of choosing where to go? Well, for medicine, it's a big choice. There are around 40 courses out there, and you can only apply for 4 of them. For dentistry, it's more restricted. There are only 14 courses. And, some of the narrowing down is done quite easily. So, again, we'll talk about this in more detail, but, you have to be very careful applying, for example, to Scottish medical and dental schools, because they give preference to Scottish applicants. And so you have to be really, really good to have a chance at those places. So for most people, the sensible thing is not to consider them. That narrows it down a bit, but still there's choice to be made. So how are you going to do that? So one thing that's worth knowing about is that the approach to teaching is not the same everywhere. So if you look at the prospectuses, they will always tell you what the course structure is like, what particular innovations they've made in how they put the material across, in how they assess you, in how they give you clinical experience particularly. And it's worth reading those things and thinking, oh, I like the sound of that, I don't like the sound of that. They're also you have to think about the fact that you're going to be living in wherever you go to for 5 or even 6 years. So it is worth thinking about, is that a city I'd want to live in? Particularly, for example, if you have outside interests that you want to be able to pursue as well. if you're a mountain climber, you don't want to go to East Anglia because it's flat. Stuff like that. It's worth thinking about. But while it's worth factoring those in, what you mustn't do is draw up a list of the 4 ones that fit your bill and say, right, those are the ones I'm going to apply to because those are the courses I really like. There's nowhere else I want to go to. Because the really important consideration is that, okay, if you have spectacularly good GCSEs, by which I mean mainly 9s, A stars, and if you get in that top 10% of UCAT scores, then you can apply pretty much anywhere, and choosing the courses you really like, the cities you really like, is the right thing to do. But for most people, this is the question. Because it's so competitive, you just have to play the strategic game and try to find the place where you're most likely to get in. And again, you've got to be careful talking to older people, because older people will say, no, don't do that. Unless you go to a top ranking medical school, you won't have any chance of a future in medicine. And that is nonsense. It's really important to know that that is nonsense. Yes, it was true in the 1950s that you should aim to go to one of the top London medical schools. But now your prospects, if you go there, are no different than if you go anywhere else. In medicine, the whole career is structured like that. So when you graduate, the first thing you do is go on to a 2-year foundation program, and the way that it's decided where you will do that foundation program is that you list where you want to go, and they'll let you put various places in order, and then they just use a computer program to try and get everyone as close to the top of their list as they can. Just sort of to minimize the number of people who have to go to places they were less keen on going to. And that's it. There's no credit given for whether you go to a fancy medical school or a more, a newer one that doesn't have the long history. That's not taken into account at all. Nor, interestingly, is how well you do at that medical school. So, the top applicant at the poshest school has exactly the same chance of getting their first choice as, the lowest successful student at the least sort of fashionable school. So don't worry about where it is. And don't worry about the fact, but, I'll learn much more, I'll be taught to be a better doctor if I go to this school rather than that one. And again, that really isn't true, because if you think about it, all of these schools have to teach essentially to the same standard, because they've got to turn out people who can go onto the wards at the start of their foundation training and not kill people, because they've got to start being doctors at that point. So their focus is on making sure you have the clinical competence you need. And they've all got to teach to that standard, otherwise it would be dangerous. So it's not like it would be, if you were applying to study physics, for example, then it's true that, you would be studying physics to a higher level at Imperial College, or Oxford or somewhere than you would at some of the smaller universities, just because they'll be taking students with a sort of higher intellectual rank at those universities, so they can stretch them a bit more. So for those kind of subjects, you do have to think about, is this the right place to suit me, based on how clever you are and so on. But it's really not like that for medicine, because they've all got to teach to the same standard, and the authorities monitor them to make sure they are teaching to that standard. So it doesn't matter where you go. And your career beyond that, they look at how well you've done in your clinical setting. They don't care about where you studied to start with. In dentistry, it's a little bit different, because when you qualify, you then have to apply to individual practices to start out as a junior dentist, you're still going to be trained in those first few years, but you are part of an individual practice. But again, they tend not to care where you studied, because again, they know that you'll have been taught to the same level. And also, there is a huge shortage of dentists, so generally they're going to be keen to employ you, wherever you went. So again, you don't have to worry about that. And that opens the door to strategic applications. And that's what I'm going to keep emphasizing all the way through this process. Okay, so how does the application work? Well, say UCAS is the key to it. That application itself has to be together by the middle of October. But because it has to be processed in college, which takes quite a lot of time, realistically it's the beginning of October that it has to be ready. So that means that you want to have all your preparation done before you get back in the beginning of the autumn term this year. UCAT you do during the summer. What I'm going to suggest, we'll talk much more about this next week when we start talking about UCAT, but what I'm going to suggest is that your main window of preparation for that will be after your summer mock exams, and then you'll work on it for quite a few weeks, getting better and better and better, and do it right at the end of the summer, just before, or possibly just after, but ideally just before you come back to college. So by the time your application has to be put in, UCAT will be done and dusted. The reason I say to focus on it only after your mock exams is that you mustn't forget the importance of A levels in all of this. And it's easy to get distracted by all these other hurdles and forget that you are going to need 3 A's. Probably, a few people find ways of getting slightly lower offers, but for the majority of you, you are going to need 3 A's, possibly an A star for some of the medical courses. And you can't take your eyes off the ball when it comes to your academic studies for that reason. So I'm not going to suggest, you need to start doing less work for your A levels because you've got to start worrying about UCAS, because that would be disastrous. There's no point getting a spectacular UCAT score, and then getting lots of offers and then not ending up going there because your A levels don't work out. So you've got to focus on being on track for 3 A's or not too far away by the end of this year. So that needs to be the big priority for the moment. If you're there already, just keep your eye on the ball, make sure you stay there. If you're not hitting those levels yet, now is the time to start trying to get that sorted out. Increase the work rate or talk to your teachers about what you need to be doing differently, but really start focusing, eyes on the prize, 3 A's at the end of this. And that is incredibly important. The other reason those mock exams in the summer are important, firstly, because they tell you whether you are on track for those 3 A's, but secondly, because your teachers, when you do this UCAS application, your teachers have to make a prediction of what grade you're going to get in your A levels. And obviously they don't really know, so there's quite a lot of flexibility in that, but they have to make an evidence-based decision as to what you're likely to get. So if you get a B in your mock in one of your subjects, and you talk to the teacher and say, I know that I can do a little bit better than that. I know that I can get an A, and I'm very motivated to work for that because I'm applying to be a dentist or whatever. In general, they will absolutely listen to that, and they'll say, I believe you. I'm prepared to predict you an A. But if you go along and say, I know I got an E in my mock exam, but I want to apply to Cambridge, so I need an A star prediction, they will just laugh. You've got to be realistic about this, that you've got to provide them with some evidence that you are capable of getting those high grades. And that means doing the work. And so long as they can see that you're really going for it, they will be flexible, but they can't be infinitely flexible in making those grade predictions. And they do matter. Not for every university, so it's not necessarily the end of the road if you don't get 3A predictions, but it is a problem for quite a few. Okay, so we'll talk about the form later, but all of the preparation has to be in place, because all you'll really have time to do is finalise it, and that includes the personal statement, which is a part of this. So let's just talk briefly about that. Overall, it's around a page, and there are 3 questions they ask you to write about. So why do you want to study this course or subject? So that's obviously something you need to have thought a lot about. And it can't just be as simple, oh, I've always wanted to since I was 3 years old. You know, you need to show that you've made a much more recent, secondary decision, if you like, as well as that you've looked at the reality of the course, you've understood the positives and the negatives, and the positives absolutely win out, and these are your reasons why. Second one is about qualifications and how they've helped you to prepare for this course. This is the one which, if you were applying for academic courses, the people would be saying, this is the big one, you've got to write loads about this. But I'm exactly the opposite. This is the one you say least about for these courses, for the reasons we mentioned earlier, that they're not interested in academic stuff. They're interested in your people skills. The grade itself just speaks for your academic ability as far as they're concerned, and they don't want you to waffle about it here. So there's a minimum you have to write, and you can, it's a sentence or 2, so you have to do that, but that's not the big one. The big one is the third one, because this is where you write about what you've learned from volunteering, from part-time jobs, potentially from shadowing if you've done some. But it's not a list of what you've done. They're not going to be impressed by the long list of what you've done. It's your reflections on it, what you've learned from it. That's what you need to talk about here. It is true that a lot of the medical and dental schools don't actually use the personal statement, which is incredibly annoying when you spent a lot of time, crafting it. Some of them have their own forms that they send out instead, but they're very similar, and you can use what you've done in your personal statement to help you complete those forms. And some of them don't really tell you, but they say, well, we don't score it, but we do read it. And you think, well, okay, so it's got to be pretty good anyway. And so the only safe assumption is that because it's information they have about you, they may potentially use it, and it has to be good. So we will help you make sure that it is. And that's something we'll talk about again later in this Reach course. If you get through all of those things successfully, so that you get a high enough UCAT score, if that's their selection policy, or you get a high enough overall score, factoring in your GCSEs and potentially your personal statement as well, then the final hurdle is the interview. And at most places, at that point, it becomes a level playing field again. So it doesn't matter if you just scraped by on your pre-interview score, or whether you got the highest one in the country. It's still all to play for at that point, because most of them don't take into account that earlier scoring. Some of them do. So again, you need to know which ones those are, so that if you got spectacular UCAT and so on, you can think, oh right, okay, this would be a good place to apply to, because I'm going to be sort of at the top of the preliminary list before the interview. But most of them don't, and that's useful to know. So what's the interview like? Well, it's kind of weird, because they will ask you questions which are often not like the kind of questions you may have been asked before in everyday life. And you're going to be judged not just on what you say, but on how you say it. Because they say what they're trying to get from the interview is, are you the kind of person that's going to be good at working with people? And that means, in part, good at communicating with people. And so they can judge that not just based on your answer, but on how you deliver that answer. And that's what we're going to help you prepare for by talking about it, but most particularly by giving you practice interviews, and that will be during the autumn term. So here are some examples of the questions. First of all, there are the ones that you can expect and that you can be ready for. What have you done to prepare for this application? What are the key qualities that make a good clinician? Why do you want to do this? And those kind of things they will expect you to have thought about. But that doesn't mean they want a prepared speech. They hate prepared speeches. because they want you, as I say, they're interested in how good you're going to be talking to a patient or talking to your colleagues. So they want you to be conversational. They want you to sound natural and genuine. And it's very hard to sound natural and genuine. You know, it's like watching a bad actor in an amateur dramatics thing, you know, where they recite the lines perfectly, but it just sounds awful because it's very sort of forced and unnatural. And it's difficult to avoid that if you've prepared a speech. So the thing to do is to have some bullet points in your head that you're going to talk about, but then talk about them in a spontaneous, natural way. And you may not know whether you sound natural or not, so that's why the practice interviews are important. Sometimes they're more specific than that, and they will ask about specific qualities like empathy, for example. And this is where your experience can be important, because you know, everyone applying for medicine or dentistry is going to have read, oh, you must talk about empathy. And a lot of people will just say, oh, yeah, it's really important that a doctor is empathic, so empathy is important. And you think, okay, what does that mean? Why is it important? How do you show empathy? So you've got to think about that quite a lot. But as I said, the most impressive way you can talk about that is to say, well, a situation where I found that, you know, empathy was important, or where I found empathy was difficult, but I had to struggle to achieve it, was this, and then talk about something that you have done yourself. So, you know, an example might be if you volunteer at the hospice, you know, you can talk about the challenge of, you know, how do you empathize with someone who's in the last days of their life? I mean, that's not an experience that's hopefully anything like you've been through. So it's quite difficult to imagine what that person is feeling. And so you have to, you know, feel your way very carefully and try to judge how to talk best to them so that they will enjoy and get something from the interaction with you. So any kind of experience you've got, try to start thinking about, was there empathy involved in that interaction, or was lack of empathy involved in why that interaction wasn't successful? So we'll talk when we talk about volunteering and so on, we'll talk about these things that you need to be reflecting on, and this is going to be your opportunity to bring them in. You know, coping with difficult patients, working with your team, being a good team player, these are all kind of things that you have to expect to be able to talk about and to be quite specific about. And then you get the really personal questions, and these are the most difficult ones. So, you know, what have you learned about yourself from the stuff you've done? Talk about something you've done wrong and what you learned from it. And the thing is with these, that some people shy away from that and don't want to talk about something that was actually an important mistake. So that, you know, if you start talking about an error you made in your last chemistry test, they're not going to be impressed. You've got to be honest about something that you know, really felt bad about afterwards and felt, I really shouldn't have done that. I should have done that differently, or I should have done something when I didn't, or whatever. That's what they want you to talk about, because they want you to be self-aware. They want you to know when things are going well and things are not going well, and to do something about it when things are not going well, to know how to, you know, what your problems are, because they won't all just be, you know, when you're doing your training, they won't all just be, oh, you know, I haven't got to grips with the cardiovascular system yet, because that will be kind of obvious. But it's more, are you learning to interact with the patients effectively? And they need to see that you have that sort of self-awareness. My favourite one of those is that last question. How would someone who doesn't like you describe you? That's not something I made up. That was a real question that Bristol asked a couple of years ago. So you have to be very self-aware to answer that. And again, you know, you can't just talk about your bad haircut or whatever. You've got to say things, you know, that show that you do things that irritate people. If you just say, oh, well, everybody likes me, so I can't answer that question, again, they're not going to be impressed. Okay, so I'm going to stop there because we've covered as much as we realistically can in one session. So in subsequent weeks, we're going to go through those things in a lot of detail, starting next week with, well, actually I haven't really decided, but probably with UCAT, but we'll see. But we'll leave it there for today. As I mentioned, please do get in touch if you're worried about your GCSE profile, or if you're worried about the experience that you're getting from your volunteering or your job or whatever. So if you're not confident about those things, let me know, and I can have a look and get back to you about it. Otherwise, I will see you next week.